Hello, good afternoon. On behalf of Badminton Panam, we welcome you to our Coach Corner program. My name is Adrián Gómez, and it is a pleasure for me to be your moderator today. In today's session, we have the pleasure to welcome one of the most prominent experts in coaching and sports psychology. I'm talking about Dr. Steve Smith, renowned for his broad experience and innovative approach, which has significantly contributed to the progress of athletic development through ecological dynamics, benefiting both athletes and coaches at an international level. Before I leave you with our guests, please allow me to tell you a little bit about Professor Smith. He is a professor at the Winchester University in the United Kingdom with experience in sports, coaching, and psychology focused on ecological dynamics and athletic development. He has also competed in badminton tournaments, and coached national youth champions, combining his competitive experience and his experience as a coach. He has also done research on coaching for the BWF, and he's currently writing a book on the ecological dynamics application to improve athletes' performance and skill acquisition. So, without further ado, good evening, Steve. Welcome to our program. Thank you for joining our audience and welcoming us to your home in Hampshire, in Winchester. The platform is yours. Please share your screen and start your presentation.
Thanks very much for giving me the opportunity to present today. I'm very much looking forward to delivering this presentation and allowing you to see hopefully the passion for this subject that I have, which is one that really is trying to revolutionize how we coach. And it's taking our processes from where we used to think they were, as in the brain acts very much like a computer, where we have some sensory input, we have decisions being made, and then we have an output. We know that the brain in sport doesn't quite work like that. It needs to work with behavior, and it needs to be acting very, very quickly to situations. So what I'll do today is I will talk about ecological dynamics and what that is. I'll then look at, or then hopefully I'll involve the audience as well to have a little think about specific topics. And we'll have a look at how we can implement potentially a better style of coaching, which will involve the perceptual cues that are within the badminton match play environment. First of all, to set the scene, many years ago, back when I was trying to develop as a competitive badminton player, I would often have situations where I'd train in the week and I would then get to the weekend and I'd go to a tournament, and I would find that the practice work and developmental work that I did in the week was very different to what I would experience at the weekend. So that really, when I finished playing and went into coaching, that was always something that I thought to myself was there seems to be a disconnect between the practice environment, so where I was developing and training, to then what I was doing in a competitive environment. And that then led me on in my academic career onto ecological dynamics. So first of all, I would just like to give everyone about a minute just to have a think about these questions, because the competitive nature of a sport like badminton is really important to understand so that we can take those principles into our training and our practice environment. So a couple of questions here. And I also want you to have a think about these questions in regard to different ability levels, thinking about ages, youth players compared to senior, think about disciplines, singles, doubles, and also male to female differences. So it may be something that you've never thought about before, but how long does a rally last? How long does a game last? What's the ratio between play and rest? How many shots are there per second? And what's the average shots per rally? So I'll give you a couple of seconds just to have a little think about that. Hopefully, there's some of you there that are going to be pretty close to what the research and what the analysis says on this, because to really understand how we prepare our athletes, we really need to know what they're doing in the competitive environment. So let's have a look at this. This is very much an average across the 5 disciplines. So, and again, taking it from a more of an elite level, but match durations go anywhere between sort of 40 and 50 minutes. What's really interesting here, though, is things like performance time and rally time compared to rest time. And we've got some really interesting ratios here where if you were to look at women's doubles compared to men's singles, for example, there's a longer rest time. Now, it's only 3 seconds on average, but over the space of a set of and badminton, which could last on average about 35 rallies, that's quite a long time. You've also got performance time, for example, in women's doubles, which is far higher. Now, you might think about that and say, well, hold on, if women's doubles is performing in a higher time percentage of the total match, but not resting as much, there might be some different things going on in a women's doubles game compared to, say, a men's singles game. What we have to do, like I said at the start, was recognize what we're doing in the competitive game and how we take that forward into practice. Within disciplines, things change a lot, and hopefully that will come through today. What I think is really interesting is that the 2 columns on the end there is, as an average, if you take the median shots per rally, we're anywhere between 3 and 4 shots per rally. That's it. Okay, so it's 3-4 shot. There are larger ranges there, and women's doubles goes from 1 shot up to 41 on the analysis undertaken by these sources. Women's singles 1 to 21, but the average is quite a low level of shots per rally. Now, most coaching, when we are practicing shots and techniques and movements, it won't be done within smaller ranges. It's usually done in ways where we focus most of our attention on the actual technique. So what we do is we forget about the bits that come around the movement and we just focus on the hitting action. And as we go through today, hopefully you'll see where the issues may be with that. Finally, on this slide, the shots per second are quite interesting. So there's massive differences there. In singles, we're hitting far fewer shots per second than we are in doubles. So we have differences there. Our eyes, so our vision, our movements, they are doing different things. Our reaction times, our anticipation, where we're viewing, everything changes between those disciplines. So we need to make sure that we are separating the disciplines out. We are ensuring that we're not separating the requirements for competition and for the requirements of practice. So what we're trying to avoid is the pictures on the left-hand side there, where we have the top one, multiple shuttles being fed at fast rates. So if we think about how many shots per second there are, it's less than 1. What you find in a lot of those multi-feed drills, and you'll see them all over social media, from international training camps, national centres, you will absolutely see feeding drills which are quick, that players have to respond to shuttles very, very quickly. That doesn't happen in competition. So you would ask, that skill that you're trying to develop there, what is the purpose behind that? The second picture on the left-hand side, we can look at cones on a court for markers. Now, there's definitely no cones or markers on a badminton court. So straight away, you could argue, well, that's very unrealistic. The feeder looks like they're hand feeding as well, which we'll come on to in a few minutes' time. And the bottom figure there of someone trying to elevate their height by standing on a step to get the downward trajectory. There's massive issues with that, which we will come on to in a minute. What we want to try and do is we want to take our practice environment and make it as realistic to competition as possible. Now, unfortunately, when we have a focus on technique of shots and movements specifically, we tend to lose everything around it. And it's not just badminton, it happens in a lot of sports around the world. Some sports have moved further with ecological dynamic approaches, some haven't. So I've talked a lot about ecological dynamics and obviously within the title. So you might all be sitting there now thinking, what is ecological dynamics, which you should be, I would be. It's something that's been around for a very long time, and it's only just started. I say only just started to come into sport, but potentially in the last 2 decades, we've seen it coming more and more. Now, with any form of theoretical model, it takes quite some time to drip down into sports. So some sports are further ahead and some are not. There's 2 main elements. There's more to ecological dynamics than just these 2, but the 2 main elements are ecological psychology and something called dynamical systems theory. Trying to place this very simply now, is ecological psychology is in regard to the perceptual information that you have within your environment. So if we think about a badminton environment, it's not a particularly big environment. It only goes roughly about 6 meters wide, the whole court, and about 13.5 meters in length, with a net in the middle, and about 1 meter, 1.5 meters, roughly around there, with a drop in the middle. So we know the court dimensions. So it's a very small area. But there is a lot going on there. So when we're playing in singles or doubles, what we are responding to is our opponent location, where the shuttle is, where my position is on the court, what I've previously done in that position. I might be looking at my opponent's intention. So what do I think they're going to be doing? And all of that links into something called perception action coupling. So my actions are purely based on the perceptions that I have within my environment. And that opens up to my affordances. Now, my affordances, very fancy word, essentially what it means is what is available to me. What is available to me within that environment, within the perceptual cues that I have. So somebody who's a beginner will have far less affordances than somebody who is an expert in badminton. An expert will have a variety of shots that they can play from a variety of positions. So ecological psychology essentially is ensuring that we have the perceptual information within the environment. Now, my argument, and again, we're going to come on to this shortly, is that throwing a shuttle over to a player in a hand feeding situation takes away a lot of the perceptual cues that a badminton player will be actioning off of. That's a massive problem. That's a massive problem for skill development, for practice, for our skill acquisition, all across the board. Dynamical systems theory suggests that within any sport, or actually with any group of humans within an environment, that given time, they will self-organize. So they will understand the tasks based on the constraints. Now, I've already mentioned the constraints. The constraints in badminton is the court size. It's potentially your height, your power, your striking action, your opponent's ability. There's lots of constraints there. The biggest one in badminton probably is your ability to play different shots. I mean, that will constrain you to only be able to do a certain amount of things from a certain amount of places. But within this system, within the constraints given to us, people, individuals, and groups will self organize. So, what we won't need to do is we will not need to tell people exactly how to do something, they will work it out themselves. Now, as Adrian said, I'm currently writing a textbook all about ecological dynamics, and I could probably talk for several hours about this. Well, I know I could. Um, and there's huge amounts that need to be known about feedback, which we won't have time to get onto today. Um, but feedback is incredibly important from an internal mechanism point of view. If you allow somebody to experience something, to trial, to make errors, to fail, failure is good. We always need to ensure that we understand failure is good because failure means learning. As long as we allow that to occur, and we limit the external feedback telling people what to do, and we have an environment which allows that to happen, we should see self-organization. So that is ecological dynamics in a nutshell. It is on the face of it, it's fairly simple. It is complex, but this is what we're working to today. So we've recently, myself and colleagues here at the University of Winchester, we've conducted several badminton studies over the last few years. Um, Several of them have been funded by BWF. This study was one that I think really showed the differences between the actions of the body when we change levels of predictability. Now, what I mean by predictability is if we're in a match situation, if you imagine you're in a match situation, it's very unpredictable. You have no idea where your opponent is hitting the shuttle to. You don't know if they're going to slice it, if they're going to play a deceptive shot. You don't know that. You don't know what's going to happen. If we look at a predictable environment, such as the picture there, where somebody's throwing a shuttlecock over the net, that's highly predictable. You know it's going to be an underarm throw. You know you've probably already been told the location, and you have the rhythm of the underarm throw as well. So it's highly predictable. That type of feeding happens very often at lower ability levels. Thinking about keeping the shuttle in a very easy to hit position for a beginner, which is understandable why you would think that. But it's also done as we move up, even to international level players. What we tend to find at international level is the feeder stays in the same position and they have a racket rather than using hand feeding, but it's still the same. It's still producing a predictable situation where they are hitting from a central location that doesn't move, a static location, I should say, that doesn't move on the court, and they're probably hitting it from an underarm position or a drive position. So there's two things, and that's it. Predictability again. So, what did the research say, or what did the research find when we compared predictable feeding for net lunge? So that's forehand and backhand. And when we looked at match play, now the results were quite astonishing. I predicted they would be this, but I didn't predict they would be this pronounced and be this different. The wrist height, so that the position where the shuttle was being struck by the person at the net, was on average 40 centimeters higher in predictable feeding. Now, if you think about 40 centimeters is quite a big distance, but if you look at it in terms of the total height from match play to the predictable feeding, it's 151% higher than match play. That's a huge amount. We're not talking a few percent here. We're 151% higher. Huge amount. We then looked at wrist velocity, so the speed at which the player is moving to the shuttle. Now, it was 1 meter per second slower. We might think, oh, it's only 1 meter per second, but it was 50% slower. That's a huge difference. Shoulder height, So now we're looking at posture of the player. It was a 25 centimetre height difference, which again replicated with a 151% higher position. Hip angle decreased, knee angle decreased, trunk angle decreased as well by quite large margins. What that meant was, and what that showed, was that with predictable feeding, we had lunge depth that was significantly less. So the player ended up being higher when they were striking the shuttle. Players more upright, far more upright, back was straighter. They could strike the shuttlecock in a much higher position and earlier because they got to the shuttlecock earlier, because they anticipated. They didn't have a delayed reaction to the movement. They just went straight to it. Now, what we find, what researchers found, is that when you have a higher racket position, when you're playing at the net, you make far less errors. That would make sense, wouldn't it? Because a shuttle doesn't have to go as far. But in match play, you're much lower. You're under much more pressure. You are bent over. Now, our argument would be if you're practicing from a far higher position, 40 centimeters at the wrist, you're coming in slower, you know where it's going. Are you practicing the correct skill? You're practicing something like the correct skill, but is it the same as what you practice in a match? With that outcome from this research, I would strongly argue that you are not. You are not allowing that practice to occur that's going to happen in competition. Now, a lot of people would argue and say, well, at beginner level, we probably do need to make it more predictable. But there's a problem. If you make it very, very predictable at that beginner level, you're then just going to have to increase the unpredictability later on down the line. So you're having to teach somebody a skill that looks like the final skill and then teach them the final skill. So again, we could argue, why not just teach them the full skill from the very start? And this is where I said about failure being good and failure being something we want to encourage. So a coach's job is to cause failure, make it happen, but support the player through that. So failure is okay, because what we want to do, and what happens with ecological dynamics, is we don't have a linear progression. Once I've completed this skill, I can now move on to this skill. What we have is a non-linear pedagogical approach through ecological dynamics. It means that people will go up and down, up and down. The research has shown that the up at the end, if we take this in long term, the up will be far greater than the up would have been through linear approaches. That's the theory. So I just wanted to leave you again with maybe 30 seconds, gives me a chance to have a drink. But 30 seconds to have a think about these questions. So why do we think that the predictable practice produces those changes? So what has changed? So what have we lost? So what does cause delay in movement and striking and lower striking position during match play? So I'll give you maybe 30 seconds just to have a think about it. What are we losing? Hopefully you've got some ideas in your head, but we're going to go through them. This is a very, very big part of badminton, and one that I believe we lose hugely when we conduct predictable badminton training. Visual search behaviour. So I imagine everyone on this call or listen to this would have played badminton at some point. Let's hope so. When you're playing badminton, you are constantly looking for things within your field, okay? And these are your perceptual cues. If you see somebody like the player there, if you saw that still, you would probably imagine that player, they might hit a clear, but I would look at that player and think they're going to hit a smash shot. So if I think they're going to hit a smash shot, I will prepare myself for a smash shot. I might be looking at racket position. I might be looking at, are they going to slice the shuttle? I might be thinking, what have they done before? What's been a popular choice of theirs? But what research does show with higher level players is actually what they don't do is they don't look at specific movements on the body. They don't look at specific hand positions or exactly where the grip is or what the racket's doing. They take more of a gross um, picture of movement. It's not to say that we're not taking in this information, but those finer details reveal themselves in other ways. I've got a couple of things that we could pick out here. So the first one is what we might lose or what we might be searching for is the height of the shuttlecock flight. So have you punched it quite quickly to the rear court or have you put it quite high up in the air? That will then dictate what you do in your recovery. So that's going to be important. If you have hit it high to the back, you don't know where it's going to go. It could be a smash, it could be a drop, it could be a clear, it could be a cross court shot. What is the opponent's body position? What are they doing? And all of this information is delaying your response because you have to see what's coming and then understand where the shuttle might go to then to then anticipate and then react to what has actually happened. The arm swing action is massive. Is what is their arm doing? That's got a lot of telling information in the way that the arm is swinging. What you probably find at the very top level is that the arm action is incredibly similar for most shots. And this is why the physical conditioning is so important in top level players because it's very difficult to anticipate and they have to react, which again really puts an argument in there. If you know where the shuttle's going and you're going to be early on it, you're not practicing the same skill as you would do in a match because you're always going to be delayed. We look at how much torso rotation there is. If they're going to hit the shuttle harder, you would expect to see more torso rotation. Hopefully, you guys would have thought about some of these previously. Jumping movements, have they jumped? If they've jumped very high in the air, expect the potential for a steeper trajectory of the shuttle. So you'll be preparing yourself in that way. What about your position and your readiness? Have you recovered to a central base position or a base defensive position that you're happy with? What is the intent? What do they look like they're going to do? I think shot intention is probably wrapped up in all of this information. And then previous shots they've played. So as you know, when you play someone in a competitive game of badminton, players will have favoured shots. They will have shots that they will hit more winners off of or may potentially make more errors off of. So you've got to have a think as well in the action they're undertaking as what have they done before. So lots of information there, lots of visual information that is impacting predictable versus unpredictable practice. So when we are practicing and feeding predictably, we might lose all of that information. Now, all of that information is critically linked to the shot the player is about to play, because that's what happens in competition. Okay. So next study that we undertook, what we looked at was now mechanical load. So what we found previously was the body and the biomechanics would change between unpredictable match play and predictable feeding. Now, in this study, the picture at the top right there, we used racket feeding. But the racket feeding was still very predictable and something that you will see probably across most badminton practice environments across the world, where there's a static feeder location and the hitting action will either be underarm or overarm. So what we did in this study is we attached an accelerometer, which is a little device that detects the amount of force that goes through parts of the body. We attach it to the lower back and we attach it to the racket leg. In badminton, there's three main areas of the body that get injured the most. One is the shoulder, which we didn't assess on this occasion due to the focus that we wanted to have on landing and mechanical load on landing. But we did look at the lower back, which is very prominent in injury, as well as a racket leg. So for a right-hander, that would be their right leg. So what we found when we compared match play to predictable multi-feeding style training, where the coach would feed a series of shuttles that is representative of match play. So we're trying to represent a match play environment, but we're having an area of the court where the player knows where the shuttle's coming from, and that was all. So we still have unpredictability of where the shuttle's going to be hit to, but it's coming from one place with one action, which was underarm. So if we start with lower back and we look at the around the head corner, and then we've got the rear court on the forehand. This is for right-handed players. So the predictable feeding drill, we had 16% less mechanical load going through the lower back on the around the head, and 7% less on the rear court. Now, on the forehand, you think that's okay? 16%, 7%. Yeah, so we looked at lower back and racket leg. So as you can see on the courts there, we're going to start over on the lower back. We have the around the head corner. We have the rear court forehand. So 16% and 7% less mechanical load through the lower back in those corners on average. Now, and this was with elite participants. You would probably say, or you could say, that might be acceptable. It's possibly tolerant. It's not a huge amount away from being the same as competition load. Now, if we look at the racket leg, so for a right-hander, right leg, for a left-hander, left leg. If we look at around the head and the rear court forehand, we have 37% less mechanical load around the head and 11% less on the rear court forehand. Now, the 11%, again, you might look at tolerance, that would be okay, but 37% less mechanical load going through the racket leg on an around the head shot. That's a lot of load that's missing. Now, the around the head shot is a very dynamic shot, but it just shows that when we're predicting where the shuttle goes, or it's predictable where the shuttle's coming from, we might be able to move a little bit earlier, and we can get there quicker, and we don't have to work as hard. So let's look at the lower back at the forecourt. So we've got the forecourt backhand and the forecourt forehand. Exactly, both of them were 22% on the lower back. It's starting to build now. Minus 22% on both sides. That's a fifth of the load that's missing. I would worry. That's something that would worry me, purely because not only from the fact that am I training in the right way, but in practice, I want to load my body in preparation for match play. If I'm not preparing my muscles in the right way, I'm likely to get injured in a match play situation because my muscles aren't used to it. Here's the real issue we have, and it's at the forecourt. Just have a look at those numbers. So the forecourt backhand shot was roughly 46% less mechanical load when we had predictable feeding. And the forecourt, the forehand was 53% less. So at the forecourt, the forehand, we're loading the body in the lunge position less than half of what would be in a game. If you tie this into the mechanical differences, the biomechanical differences, and the position of the body, you can understand that we are still getting to that shuttle earlier and higher with less force now than we would do in a match situation. This whole picture is painting a scenario that is very worrying, not only for producing skills that are accurate with visual search behavior, but that the lack of for mechanical position, so for shot play, technical shot play, with that lack of visual search behavior in predictable feeding, we can get there quicker and easier. So if you spend a long period undertaking predictable training, you will not load the body in preparation for competition, and you won't be training it in a way that will develop that body for that competition. What we now might be switching to, and what I advise all coaches that I consult with and talk to, Advise them to go little and more often. Think about what the actual dynamics of the match is. We tend to train, most people will train for an hour, hour and a half on technical shots, potentially at a high level, whereas a match play at the highest level will roughly last 40, 45, 50 minutes. So let's have higher level, unpredictable training in shorter bursts, which replicate match play, not only to give us a technical advancements and technical abilities linked to visual search behavior, but also the mechanical load. So the key for everything that we look at can be almost be summed up by this, is that if we do isolate skills, so we take them away from their competitive position within match play and we isolate them, let's say through predictable feeding where players don't have to move and they just strike a shuttle, or the feeding is very predictable, we remove those key perceptual cues that are required in the competitive game. We are destroying or disrupting, breaking down the whole skill. The skill is not just the striking of the shuttlecock, it's the parts before it, it's the parts after it. Skill is everything before and after that shot. And here's where we have some considerable advancements of ecological dynamics and where we want to move away from final shot analysis with winners. We have something called perturbations in all sports. In badminton, for example, when we have a singles game, it's much simpler than it is, say, for a soccer game or a rugby game or a hockey game. We have two individuals who are trying to maintain their defensive stability. At the same time, they're also trying to destabilize their opponent's stability to try and cause their opponent to make an error or for them to score a winning shot. Now, the winning shot is often not the shot that creates the opportunity for the winner. So it's not the opportunity that perturbs the system. So within ecological dynamics, when we have game-based play, where we have all of our perceptual information, we can now start to work under multiple shot situations. So in the above picture, in picture A, the player in blue is just about to serve. In B, he flicks serves to the rear court. The player in white decides to play a cross-court smash. Now, the player in white is in the far right-hand corner now, so quite far away from a defensive position. As you can see, the player in blue has already played or struck the shuttle, with the player in white still in that corner. We then have the player in blue that plays a diagonal shot, which would make sense because that's where the space is. The player in white gets to that shuttlecock late, makes an error in their shot. The player in blue is able to anticipate because they're able to play the shot under less stress, and then they're able to kill the shuttle and net and win the point. The winning point was not the player in blues or the perturbation within the system, and really the most significant shot here was not the player in blue's ability to play a net kill. It was a player in white's error in playing a cross-court shot, which self-inflicted the destabilization of their defensive position. If we work within ecological dynamics, if we work outside of ecological dynamics and we isolate skills, we would never work in this system because our shots would be isolated and we wouldn't understand, and players wouldn't be linking in practice the playing of a shot from another shot to cause the outcome that they want. I now go back to the very start of my presentation today when I said that I practiced all week in very isolated terms. I then got to the weekend or the tournament at the weekend, and it would seem very different because of the isolation. It didn't fit into tournament play, what I had to do was I had to use my tournament play and my practice games within the week. That's where I undertook my learning. We can supercharge our players if we practice in a situation that includes all of the visual search behavior and it links different shots together. We can supercharge our practice and we can ensure that our players have that real boost of understanding and practicing the competition level skills. So the question here is, with our coaching, are we creating decision making? Decision making is absolutely key with our technical shots. They go hand in hand. So what we want to try and do with our coaching, and this goes across all sports, when I talk to any coach across any sport, is are we making it our environments unpredictable? We don't want to make them predictable because we cause different things to happen to the body. Are we in a situation where we're working to stabilize our own defensive position and destabilize our opponents? Now, within badminton, they both occur at the same time. In a sport such as soccer or basketball, they have distinctly different phases. It might be easier in those sports to concentrate on stabilization and destabilization in separate, distinct phases. Badminton players, unfortunately, um, haven't got that nicety. They have to do both together. They have to think about their stability while trying to destabilize their opponents. My recommendations for feeders are: do not feed in a static position. The feeder should be moving constantly. If you're going to practice in this way, if you're going to hit from a one area, for example, again, these are just examples. There are millions of ways you can do this, but move to that feeding position. That gives the player something that resembles competition a little bit more than it did before. So that's just one extra benefit you can give them. I'm all for getting players to feed each other to try and have the movement. Then think about the shot type. If the player that I'm feeding always knows it's going to one area, they will get there quicker. They will know what's happening, and the skill they're practicing won't be the same as competition. So don't have a predictable system in place. Have the player understand that it might not always go to that position. You might feed to other places. It means that player then always has to return to a base position, a central defensive position, to hold their stability while then playing the shot. So a couple of ideas there. And three more things just to leave with you before I finish today. This is straight out of the Ecological Dynamics textbook, or it will be, as it's being written now. Coaches could try working on these three focuses. The first one is intentionality. So forget about the skill or the technique and focus more on the outcome. What is the outcome you want? And allow the player to explore how to get to that outcome. Don't tell them how to do it, because everyone's different. Everyone moves differently. Everyone has an individualized experience throughout their whole lives and within their sport. So give them constraints, give them an environment where you tell them what you want them to do and allow them to get there with their own way. Let them trial and error, but give them the intention first. And that should be the focus of the coaching session. Focus on the outcome, not what you want them to do within that specific skill or movement. The second one, as I spoke about earlier, is feedback. There's going to be a whole chapter in my textbook on feedback. There's not a lot written at the moment in ecological dynamics on feedback, but it's incredibly important. The coach should not be instructing, telling what to do it this way, do it that way. We need to allow players, like I said, with intentionality, to use their own internal feedback mechanisms to understand how to get somewhere. We all know that a player will understand when they make an error, when a shot doesn't go particularly well. We don't need to tell them that. They will understand it. And it's very important that players and coaches understand that failure is acceptable. I love failure, whether I'm teaching a lecture at the university, whether I'm working with a football team, badminton players. I always start by saying What we want to achieve today is failure. We want to have failure, and that's okay because we're going to learn from it. You're going to work out how to achieve from that failure. And the final piece of this puzzle to take away would be looking at the what we call in scientific research would look at the degrees of freedom. Now that's very much, it's a very complicated area, but if I can simplify it, in degrees of freedom are the things, the movements that a player can undertake in one scenario. So in any one scenario, there are an amount of affordances, there are amount of options that a player has available to them. If we increase the predictability, we decrease the amount of freedoms they have. So they might only develop in one way or a couple of ways of playing something. If all of a sudden we increase the unpredictability and we allow them to express themselves and be creative, all of a sudden we might find players do things that haven't been done before. And this is how we invent new ways of playing. This is how we invent new shots. In lots of sports, it's very common to have new things arrive, new ways of moving. Allow players to be creative. If we don't allow that, all that happens is we regurgitate what we learned as coaches from 20, 30 years ago, and the cycle continues. So try to allow as much variance and much unpredictability as possible for players to explore and find their own way. As long as it fits within a recognised standard, we call this a bandwidth of feedback, as long as it sits within acceptable movement parameters, as a coach or as a coach educator, I would say to my coaches or the coaches I work with, just don't say anything. Let the players explore. At the end, you can have a discussion around what worked, what didn't work, but just let them play, let them create, let our players be creative. Okay, thank you ever so much for allowing me to present today. I believe now we have questions and answers, so I'll hand back to Adrian for that.
Believe me, we're already very anxious to read your book because there will be many interesting chapters as we see. So now let's move on to our usual Q&A. Please, if you have any questions or comments that you'd like to share with us, please write them down in the chat box. Steve, I have several questions here, and they're all very interesting. They're related to the topics that you just explained. There's a question over here. Can you please very briefly tell us about that feedback you were talking about during practice time? I know that this is a topic that will be included in your book, but how can we teach a type of feedback? What's your proposal?
Right, so very much long story short here, I'm going to try and keep it brief. Right, so very much long story short here, I'm going to try and keep it brief. Approach. If we work what we want to have is self-organization of the player. What we want to have the player is self-organization of the player. What we don't want the player coach to tell the answers. What we don't and for a coach, it's very, very difficult. This is something that I struggle with. And for a coach, it's very, very difficult because I see something that I struggled with, and it's trying to be quiet. Want to comment on that. I see a player do something. Oh, you should have done this. I will desperately maybe try this on that. Oh, you should have done this. What I would suggest, maybe try this as coaches. Have what I would suggest is a limit as coaches of what you consider to be acceptable. A limit if the player of what you consider to be acceptable within those limits. If the player is within that bandwidth, just within those limits, allow them to play. Don't say allow them. Just coaches, we can be quiet. Allow them to play. Don't one say tip anything. Is I would, as coaches, we can I would tell this to other coaches, and I would tell this to parents. One tip is I would what often happens. I would tell this to other coaches, and I would tell this to parents and say because what often happens is parents actually other coaches will look what you're doing is the coach. You're not coaching. Specifically, what that player is what you're doing is the coach. Your feedback comes specifically what that player is doing. Where you're questioning your feedback, comes trying to make the player find out questioning the player. You're trying
That's with
to
any
make the
learning.
player find out the
If we
answer.
teach somebody anything,
That's with any
we want
learning.
them to
find the
I-
answer.
if we teach somebody
Hopefully that
anything,
explained it
we want them to
in a
find
very
the
short,
answer. Brief time.
hopefully that explained it in a very short, brief time.
Excellent. I've seen many
Excelente.
coaches
He visto
who
muchos entrenadores que utilizan, incluso a
it's
nivel,
with
bueno,
beginner
de
athletes or
principiantes, entender las
intermediate
prácticas
athletes,
predecibles.
they
Y
use this.
no es
And
que
it's not that
esté
it's
mal,
wrong. I think that
simplemente
they
es
just
buscar la forma
need
de que
to
estas
make
prácticas
this
lleguen
practice
a
more
ser
unpredictable, as you were
impredecibles.
mentioning before. So,
¿Qué nos
what
aconsejas?
would be your advice?
¿Cuánto porcentaje ya
Perhaps at an
será que
intermediate
en más
level,
de un
should
nivel
we
intermedio
already
deberíamos ya
stop having
rolar
these
las prácticas
unpredictable
no
practices so
predecibles
so
para que
athletes
estos
can
jugadores vayan
develop these
desarrollando estas
skills?
destrezas?
Yeah, yeah. My advice would be now an ecological dynamics approach is one approach to coaching. It's one that I thoroughly believe in. The research is very much pointing towards this is the best way to practice because we're linking competition movement to practice movement. So my recommendation would be, and this is what I teach my students who are sport coaching and physical education students. I say to them, you can't coach from a textbook. The skill comes from the coach. It is up to the coach to look at a situation and say, I can make it more unpredictable by doing X, Y, or Z. It doesn't have to be, and it shouldn't be wholly unpredictable because then you are not practicing in certain areas. But even if you can take one drill, one routine that you do with a player and just make it slightly more unpredictable, then you are going to help that player to become better because they will be linking their perceptual information to the skill itself. If you can then start to add more and add more and add more within the constraints that you want to coach with, that's where you want to be. It's not easy and it takes practice, but we have to align the perceptual information in match play to what we do in practice.
Right. That's quite interesting,
Muy
actually.
interesante esa
We
parte que
have a
mencionas.
question
De
from the
hecho, tenemos
audience.
una pregunta en nuestra audiencia que nos
How
dice
long
cuánto tiempo
should these
aconsejas que debe
exercise
ser
last in a training
estas
session?
prácticas en una sesión de
Yeah,
entrenamiento.
again, that's a question that that's a question that will absolutely be asked by most coaches and has been before. I would go back to the first slide I had up or the first few slides. What happens in a competition? So in a competition, if they're playing a let's say it's just one match per day, just as an example, let's mimic that. Let's mimic that activity. So if a session is or if a match goes on for let's say we could probably extend it to an hour, it's not so much what happens for the total length of time, it's what happens within it. So if you have a look at, and it depends on discipline and age, and it will depend on certainly level, how long do the rallies last at that level? What's the rest time? Try and replicate what happens in a competition. That way, you will be able to increase the physical and mechanical load of the session, but probably decrease the volume. That's far more representative. I'm a big believer, a big believer in if you do less on a badminton court, but it's quality, that will be better than more that is not quality. So that's my recommendation.
Yeah, if we make
El
error
error lleva a la
after error,
perfección,
we
se dice
will become
prácticamente.
experts, in other
Y una
words.
última
One
pregunta.
last question. You talked a little bit
Hablaste
about
un poco acerca de las
uh,
señales perceptivas,
perceptual
como la
visuals
posición del
like the
oponente, la
position
figura del
and
volante, en la toma de
location and so on
decisiones.
and so forth.
Esto es un
This is something we
proceso
need
que
to
se debe
teach
seguir. Tenemos que
athletes how to
enseñarle a los
identify
chicos
those cues.
cómo
And this
identificar
is
esos
included in
factores. Y
unpredictable
va
practice.
dentro de las
So
prácticas no
can you please tell us a
predecibles.
little bit about
Entonces, que nos
these
hables un poquito acerca de estas
perceptual
señales
cues. And
perceptivas
can you please
y
also
creo
tell
y
us a
que
little bit
me comentes un poquito
about
también si
this
estas
unpredictable
prácticas
practice?
no
Can these
predecibles
lead little by
conllevan
little
o van
to
llevando poco a poco a
anticipation?
la percepción de la anticipación
So
en los
athletes
jugadores
can
para
foresee
percibir
their opponent's
previo
actions.
las acciones del oponente.
Yeah. First, yeah. Firstly, I think the answer really is everything's available. All the answers are there because they're in match play. So when we look at, and we might want to ask the question of how long should a practice session take and what should the physical activity that we should do in there? Well, the answer is have a look at match play. So if we want to look at the perceptual cues, we just need to have a look at match play. There's a really interesting difference between singles and doubles because within singles, you've just got to worry about your opponent's location, your location, shuttlecock location. I say only shuttlecock speed, and those all of those areas. Within doubles, you have to make or you play shots based on where your teammates positioned. You make shots based on where the opponents are positioned. So all of that information that you can see in a match, when you play in a match, all of that information, all of those visuals that come through, they are the things that are important. When you practice, if you imagine a whole week's worth of practice where you don't see any unpredictable feeding or play, and all you do is just respond to very predictable feeding, you don't get to practice and those anticipatory skills at all. So just by adding in, I say just by adding in the unpredictable nature, all of a sudden, Adrian, like you said, you are starting to develop and practice and experience the ability to anticipate movement because you're used to it. And that's the key. But the answers are there. We just look at match play. It's like any sport. I work a lot in football or soccer, as you'd call it, in the Americas, and we constantly look at how long a player has the ball for. Now, on average, a player in 90 minutes has the ball for only 1 minute. That's all. Most of their work is done without the ball. So what are they looking at? Badminton is very different because it's so quick and so dynamic. You don't have long between one shot to the next. But everything's there. We just need to look at the competition.
Thank you very much, Steve. Unfortunately, we
Muchas
ran
gracias,
out of
Steve.
time.
Lamentablemente el
Thank you
tiempo
so
se
much
nos ha
for
agotado y
sharing with
gracias
us
por
such an
compartir con
interesting presentation.
nosotros
Has been
una
quite
ponencia
interesting
exquisita,
and
muy
enriching to have
interesante
you
y ha
here in the
sido muy
program
enriquecedor
and to
tenerte en
learn
el
about the
programa y conocer las
different
diferentes ofertas
situations within our
formativas
sport.
de
We will
nuestro
be
deporte y
paying
estaremos al
attention for
pendiente
your
de tu
book. Thank
divulgación.
you.
Gracias.
And to our audience
Podrás
we've
ver
had
esta
in
y
the
otras
past.
conferencias que hemos
Before we
realizado.
finish today's webinar,
Antes
we'd
de
like to
cerrar el webinar
greet
de hoy, queremos
everyone who
saludar a
joined us
toda
today,
nuestra audiencia
in
que nos acompañó el día
particular
de hoy,
those who sent
especialmente
their
a
pictures.
aquellos que nos enviaron su fotografía.
Here we see
Tenemos
Sebastián
a
Bolbochan
Sebastián
from
Bolbochán desde
Córdoba,
Córdoba,
Argentina.
Argentina,
And from
y
Mexico,
desde
we have
México.
Maximiliano
Veo
Ávila
que se
and
hicieron presentes
Antonio
Maximiliano
Osegueda.
Ávila y Antonio Oseguera. Bien, ya para ir
And to
cerrando
finish today's
el
webinar, on
webinar del día
behalf
de
of
hoy,
Badminton
también
Panam, we'd like
queremos, en
to
nombre de la
thank the
PANAM,
people who join us,
agradecer a las personas que nos acompañaron, como son
such as the
el caso
following: Sebastian from
de las siguientes
Argentina,
personas: Sebastián
Novalis
de Argentina,
from Benin,
Novalis
Cindy from
de
Bolivia, Blanca from
Benín, Cindy, que nos
Colombia, Randy
acompaña desde
from Costa
Bolivia,
Rica,
Blanca
Wilton
de
from the
Colombia,
Dominican
Randy desde
Republic,
Costa Rica,
Andrea
Wilton
from
desde República
Guatemala,
Dominicana,
Emily
Andrea
from
desde Guatemala,
Guyana, Juan
Emily,
from
saludos
Honduras,
allá en
Max,
Guyana,
Karen, and
a
Jorge
Juan en
from
Honduras,
Mexico,
a Max, Karen y
also
Jorge
Martin
en México,
from the Netherlands,
a
Victor from
Marta
Peru.
desde
From Poland,
Holanda,
we
a Víctor
have
desde Perú,
Wojciech and
desde Polonia,
Andrew,
Wojin y
Calvin from
Andrew,
Puerto Rico,
a
and
Kelvin
Gigliola
desde Puerto
from
Rico y
Venezuela.
a Gigliola en Venezuela.
On behalf of Badminton Pan America, we thank you for your participation and we hope you like this session.
y esperamos que hayan
Greetings,
disfrutado de
everyone.
la
Take care
sesión del
and
día
see
de
you
hoy.
soon.
Cuídense y
Goodbye.
manténganse a salvo. Hasta la próxima. Bye.